Officer down! I repeat, officer down!
Welcome back to 1033. This is your host, Nathan Kapler, a podcast created for a first responder by a first responder. If you are not a first responder, you still are welcome. This podcast is aimed directly at trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD is complex and often misunderstood. Our brave men and women who serve our communities often end up with behavioral and psychological issues as a result of experienced trauma from their careers. My goal is to share what I know, my personal experience with PTSD as a retired police officer, and continue to advocate for mental health while providing support to those still in their careers. This podcast is not a substitute for professional medical help, and I strongly suggest if you are in fact suffering, you seek out professional medical advice. Please join me on this episode as I continue to expose the reality of PTSD challenges. I hope you enjoy this week's episode. Welcome back to 1033. We are here today with Jess MacLean. Jess MacLean comes to us with over 19 years of policing experience. Currently, she is a corporal with the Federal Policing Wellness Coordinator. Jess, not only are you that, you are a mother to 4 children, a wife, you have a few fur babies, and you are also dealing with post-traumatic stress. How are you doing today?
I'm all right. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So for the people listening, obviously, you and I have been connected for a while now, and we've been chatting, and I've been getting to know kind of who you are and the moral compass that exists within, and the kind of person that you are, and the immense compassion you have for other Mounties is something that I absolutely love about you. And I don't know if your journey was always like that, if you were always able to hold compassion, but I think now at this stage of the game, you've learned just how important compassion really is. And it's something that you've probably helped kind of in your own journey with PTSD. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. Yeah. I don't think it was always there, but I've learned through my own experiences, and now being in space with a lot of other people who have similar experiences, and a lot of work to be much more compassionate and open to everybody's true story.
And that's something we were just talking about too, the power of story. Like, we all have our own story. Like, you've been listening to mine, I kind of know yours. And while we maybe don't have the exact same story, when we hear each other's story, we can borrow parts of it and we can put our own story together, and we can almost offer ourselves a little bit more of a deeper healing in a sense. So before we go into like everything behind the PTSD, I'd love to give the people that are listening just an opportunity to kind of hear kind of who you are and what your journey into PTSD is, and how it kind of started.
Okay, that's a big question. So you mentioned I've been a police officer since 2003 for 19 years. I spent my career, my first several years working in White Rock, so in a small detachment, and then I took a lateral transfer to Surrey RCMP, where I worked in youth and then community policing, and then I went to federal policing. And my own career path, in White Rock, I had a number of sudden deaths and other really challenging files. And then in Surrey, I had a few really tough files. My partner was, my coworker was involved in an officer-involved shooting while I was off work. And also I went to some infant sudden deaths and other things, as well as I had a few physical altercations, one that resulted in a concussion and broken nose. So I've had a few things, in my career prior to going to federal policing. And I made a transfer to federal policing after my second marriage began. I was expecting our son, and my husband, who's also a police officer, was involved in an officer-involved shooting. So I had quite a bit going on the year that I transferred to federal policing. But all of that backstory sort of led to the development of PTSD and depression for me. And I didn't actually really realize it until my spouse began to do the work on his own injury and related to his files. And I started to recognize some of the work he was doing. I was doing my own work to try and meet him and be prepared to show up for him as a spouse and a partner. And I started to recognize some of the things for myself.
Not many people, I think, in our position maybe get the opportunity to be in a position where they're married to another police officer that's going through this struggle. For you, it's a really interesting story for me because you get to see someone struggle from it and then recognize what those struggles look like at home, because a lot of times our struggles aren't really present with us at work. As police officers, right? We're really good at hiding our struggle at work. Then we come home and then everything kind of just falls apart. So for you, you get to see those two worlds exist and the difference between them. And at the same time, you get to see kind of this chance, this opportunity for you to now reflect on, okay, if I'm seeing this in my partner, what does it look like for me?
Exactly. And the things that we sort of joke about as police officers, not so much the nightmares, although that does come up, I find, or the sleep problems or the physical pain that we, kind of live with as police officers, just wearing the gear, but also the stress that it causes on the body, which I think you've talked about in previous podcasts as well as, it shows up in your body. But then also, let's go for drinks after work and sort of escapism behavior, those kinds of things were really telling to me. The ones that were really eye-opening to myself, because I started to notice them in my spouse, were coming home from what was an average workday and just being so exhausted that they couldn't get up off the couch, which I had done for years. I would joke about taking my children to the nail salon, because I'm a girl, and go get my nails done. And I would bring my daughters with me, and they would get their nails done in the chair beside me so that I could sneak in 20 minutes of sleep because I was so fatigued all the time, which I now know is actually a very serious indicator of depression. And I probably should have caught it a lot earlier.
For you, and you talked about too the journey of being a newer member, having had gone through a divorce, and I'm guessing that also PTSD around that time was probably most likely unbeknownst to you. You didn't know you were suffering from it, or maybe you did, but you didn't see it. Do you think that also played a role in kind of the demise of that first relationship?
I think that there are other factors, and in case he hears this, I don't want to say anything to be disrespectful, but there are other factors, obviously, but I definitely the work and the PTSD. Although at that time we didn't know what it was, nobody talked about it. Nobody really ever started talking about this until I would say 2014 to 2016, where it started to be a thing that people talked about at all, and really only in the last couple of years where people are more comfortable putting their hand up and saying, oh no, I have a stress injury, or I have live with post-traumatic stress, or whatnot. So, but back then it just wasn't talked about. In 2003, it just wasn't spoken about. And but I would definitely say my ex-husband was also a police officer. So, it's possible that both of us were struggling with many things to do with the work, as well as our personal disconnects. So,
And again, like I don't bring it up to obviously put you on the spot
Yeah.
whatsoever, but I always find it interesting too, because where this goes next for me in conversation is police officers tend to have a very high rate of divorce.
Hmm.
Right? We're at a very high susceptibility for that. So my mind, now that I'm in a place of trying to nudge along my own healing and knowing some of the challenges that come from relationships when you're navigating the complex world of PTSD, I can totally hold compassion for people that have relationships that just break down. Because in PTSD, many times it becomes very difficult to even have a relationship with yourself.
Exactly. And also the instinct to withdraw and isolate, even to want to protect your partner from some of the things that you're experiencing. Those are all very, very real. And then you add in the I want to say bravado. It can never happen to me. I kind of, it just kind of making it lighthearted, but we're kind of like teenagers, we think we're bulletproof, and we have to believe that in order to safely go into our job, right? We have to be prepared for everything, and we have to believe that we're prepared so that we can run in when other people are running out. But that can carry over into your other relationships, and with your spouse, and also with your children. And I'm saying that, and I know a lot of your audience, maybe not women, but I have to say, I talk to a lot of men, and this is something that's very, very concerning to them. Men tend to talk about it a lot less, how important their families are to them, and especially amongst their peers. But what I hear regularly is that it is the most important thing, and they often don't tell their spouses and their children. They try to protect them because, as a whole, we are protective. So
For
important.
myself as a man to reflect on that statement, and I have to completely agree with you. It's only been probably since when I retired where I actually started talking to my daughter a little bit more about, hey, this is what mental health looks like, right? Like we talk a lot about your body and keeping you healthy and making sure you're eating well, or you're stretching, or you're doing exercise. But we also got to make sure we look after the mind. It's really important. And she kind of understands that. But before all of this, Jess, like I wouldn't have been caught dead talking about this stuff to my family, right? But now it's something that I've recognized the only way through it, so that everybody understands where you are, is you have to embrace that vulnerability, and you have to talk about your mental health, and you have to champion what your PTSD looks like in your family so that your family can support you. I don't know how many times, and I can say this, like this has happened a lot, where I will break down crying from something because I'm not afraid now to show my emotions. And my daughter will come over, as she's 5, and she will console me. She'll be, Dad, are you okay?
Yeah.
Right? And what a powerful moment for her to see that her dad is human. I have
Right.
emotions, and I break once in a while, and it happens, and it has to happen. For me, being a police officer, and I'm sure you can relate, there probably wasn't too many times where at a call when you felt like you probably should be crying, you did cry. You maybe went and did it later, or you maybe didn't do it at all. And you stuffed that stuff down and you kept moving forward. And that's
There's
where
just no
PTSD can
time.
come from, right? That's where PTSD
Yeah.
can come from. It's unprocessed emotion and trauma.
Yeah. And yeah. And I don't even know really how to sort of say that better. Um, and then my next thought when you say that about your daughter consoling you is that, what burden does that put to them if we're not able to do the work ourselves, right? So when you're doing the work and you're having the conversation, that's good. But I left it, and my 15-year-old cornered me because he was like, "Mom, I'm really worried about you." That's pretty sad. Yeah, I have to sit with that for a minute. But it's really hard when your child comes to you because I'm super worried because you're so sad all the time and you sleep all the time. It's not a You don't want it to get to that point. So it's so important to do the work early, and often, and maybe before you need it. I'm a big on knowing what your benefits are and using them before you need them. Just like if your back is sore, well, why don't you use that $4,000 or whatever a year it is that your benefits cover, to go proactively and get in front of that physical pain? Why don't you use the psychologist benefits that you have, the marriage counseling that you have, the extended benefits that your children have to access psychological supports, and do it before the injury or before you think you need it.
The strength too for your young man to come to you and just even acknowledge those moments, even for you, right? Because children know.
Yeah.
They know when something's not right with their mom and dad. Like, and the beautiful thing I've learned as a father is when you have kids, and you'll totally see this too, Jess, with your kids, when they come into the world, they're like these little bundles of emotion. They have no logic. And then there's us on the other end who are these bundles of logic, and we tend to have less emotion, right? So now you have these two separate types of people who are trying to figure out how to exist in the same space. And your kids will point out your emotional flaws very quickly, and they know how to read you like a book. So when they see that mom's not doing well, she's very tired, she's sad, whatever the case is, a kid's love and compassion to meet you in that space to say, hey, this is what I'm seeing. I mean, that's actually kind of a beautiful moment. It hurts to be told that, absolutely. But I think that's something too, like in the beginning when you weren't seeing the depths of your PTSD to where now you can see it through someone else's eyes and also through your husband as you're trying to help him out. You have a very good knowledge base now for your PTSD, and you know how to deal with it a lot more in a healthy way, right?
It's a work in progress for sure. I'm definitely I like to say it's a marathon, not a sprint, right? But definitely have a lot more skills just out of necessity.
And that's something too, like, I mean, even for me, like I haven't, even in retirement, I've seen my own growth and my healing take place, and I'm super pumped about where I'm at today. And I've put the hard work in to get where I need to get. Is it gone? No. I don't think
I think
PTSD
it's
necessarily
okay.
ever really goes away. And you're absolutely right. But just for us to be able to hold awareness into what does it look like for us because of the horrible things that we see, and how do we go on to lead the healthiest version possible of our life. That's
Exactly.
all we can
And
ask for.
I've heard it referred to as post-traumatic growth, and I would say that's probably what you're emulating right now is just, taking your own experience, evolving it in your body and in your mind, and then making yourself a stronger, better version that's, now able to show up for your family and for other people um, in a meaningful way. It's really powerful, actually.
Thank you. So to look back on your story with your husband and what you observed, what did you observe in him that kind of made you look at yourself and go, oh, okay, I have something here?
Um, there were a few things. The there was the one that really got me, I guess, was the coming home super fatigued at the end of a day that didn't seem like there was a lot going on. And then you don't realize that, just walking into a policing building, you're bombarded with people messaging about terrorism. Like it's, walking into the first emails you see are about all the bad guys in the world. There's a lot to take in just walking into a space like that people don't think about. And so, yeah, definitely that fatigue, and also the managing life with like coming home and having, for me, it was a glass of wine, which often was more than one glass, and then getting up in the morning and having to have coffee, and having those things kind of pointed out as something that might be an indicator of not actually being present with your emotions. Those were some of the ones that I saw by observing some of the things I was seeing with him. And as I say, withdrawing from my family was a big indicator for myself. I also share, we both worked in federal policing, and while the work is very important, the day to day doesn't tend to have a lot of ups and downs. It's fairly predictable. The schedule is fairly predictable depending on what you're working on. And but I wasn't able to manage the stress of that very well. So if they've talked about a schedule change where we move from Monday off to Friday off or something, which should be fairly easy to do. I was just really, really not able to manage that very well, and, embarrassing myself in briefings by crying over something, that everybody else was like, that's ridiculous. So, I had a bit of a rough ride there for a few years when my husband wasn't doing very well and I wasn't doing very well, and starting to recognize it for myself and just trying to manage it all. And I had a bit of a conflict with one of my supervisors, which I don't really want to get into, but we had to work through that. He and I think, found our way through, and we still are colleagues now. So, but at the time, I don't think that I was behaving in a way that he could support, and probably he was responding to me in a way that wasn't very effective either. So, yeah.
And I mean, I love the vulnerability and the authenticity and just the fact that you're able to reflect on your own journey. Cause I went through that very much as well. Like when my PTSD really got bad, it was in those briefings where I became all of a sudden a very challenging person to when someone had proposed something that I didn't agree with or had triggered me.
Right.
Right. And these again are kind of the canaries in the coal mine, right? Where you're no longer able to sit and hold space with somebody and listen to them. And now you're becoming the argumentative. You're very irritable. But again, like these things happen very naturally. It's not like you choose to allow them to happen. It's all of a sudden you're facing depression. You don't have energy. You're trying to cope with this. You might be using wine or something in order to, wind the body down at night to sleep, and then caffeine to bring it back up. So you're kind of, again, like you said, shutting down the emotions, and you're not feeling the pain, and you're not getting the rest either.
No.
So you're not even showing up.
And that's the thing. You're not sleeping. That's always the thing. We always talk about in our house, sleep is our foundation. If we have more than 2 days or 3 days of no sleep in the house, then everybody has to really do an assessment of whether whether work or school or activities are happening. Just because if we don't have that foundation, the potential for things to go sideways with 3 school-age kids and a young adult and 2 adults all not doing well is the potential for things to go really badly is high. So we have to be really mindful of that.
One of the things that my wife used to say to me, she's like, it was like walking on eggshells at home with you home.
Yeah.
She's like, I didn't know where you were at most days, whether you were going to snap, break something, or just fly off the handle from nothing.
Yeah. And I definitely experienced that. And that was actually one of the other things because I felt that way. And I eventually came to a place where I was like, no, I'm not going to anymore. These are my boundaries. But that was because I was doing the work with the mental health supports, where I was like, wait, that's not healthy for either of us. But also I started to notice it in myself. And this still happens actually, when I get off work, everybody knows what time I'm going to be home, and they make sure that the kitchen is like tidy before I get home, because the potential for me to, if I've had a rough day, to just explode over a dirty dish is very, very high. So that's just the reality of our, they're conditioned to respond to that, because they know that my work right now is a heavy burden, and we're all kind of agreeing to do it for a short amount of time.
When I finally started to accept my PTSD and some of the behaviors that come from, the dirty dish when I would come home, because again, very
Right.
much similar experience, I now look at it as, no, okay, I'm not insane or, unstable. I've gone through so much in my career. I've seen so much trauma. I no longer know how to come home and hold peace within.
Right.
I was a stick
and we
of
want
dynamite.
to, one of the symptoms is like, we need to be in control. Control is such a powerful piece of PTSD, and being able to let go of the control is really a healing tool. But also, a lot of us are going to have had the experience of going through depot, and that's what you're taught, right? Everything needs to be neat and in order, and if everything is neat and in order, then you will be safe. And that is a conditioned response for us. So when we're feeling out of control, where's our baseline? If everything is neat and in order, we will be safe.
It is one of the Yeah, it is one of the hardest things for me. I did an episode early on in the podcast where I talked about my experience with Depot. And if you would have asked me about my experience shortly after Depot, I would have said, oh, it's amazing. I got trained how to be a police officer, and, I learned all of these beautiful things. And then now as I'm retiring, I'm looking back and I'm stopping short of saying there was a degree of brainwashing that happened there. But I would definitely say that we were taught some skills that we did need to know, but they also bordered on, very, very unhealthy ways of looking at life.
Yeah. And I think when I'm going to say a word, and it's probably going to, so trigger warning, when they're talking about systemic racism, these are the things that they're talking about, right? Do these platforms hold up in our current world? Because you're right, there is definitely some conditioning. It worked for a single man in his early 20s who maybe had never prepared a meal for himself or eaten a meal or, like at a fancy dinner or made his bed or did his own laundry. But does that hold up? Like for me, Depot was actually quite fun because I had a 3-year-old at home and a house and a husband. Going to Depot, I didn't have to figure out what to eat. I had to do my laundry. Right? Like I already had a full-time job. This was just, a little bit more fitness for sure than I was used to at the time. But
I can remember one of the big things that came out of Depot, and it was always watch people's hands, right? There was a big training element around the hands. The hands are going to kill you. And for me, like I definitely spent a lot of time reflecting on that now in retirement, because I still to this day catch myself looking at people's hands and I go, okay, normal people don't think like this. And it's really hard to challenge myself, because in retirement now I actually try to challenge myself to say, okay, what would a normal, I use the word normal, what would a civilian do in this situation? How would they approach this? Would they come into it with like this state of like hypervigilance and like scanning the environment and looking at the hands and thinking, what 20 things are going to happen in this scenario and what do I need to think about so that I stay alive? The amount of things that happen in our brain while we are going to calls and dealing with people is so intense. And then that can translate into our actual life too, right? When we're out just doing different things, shopping. And it's so critical that in order to get successful with those trains of thought, we actually have to almost try to eliminate them so that we can invite the body to find a place of peace and slow down so that it can recover. It's so difficult. Like
it's so interesting. It's the thing where when you have a group of police officers, first they can't decide where they want to eat, but once they do get there, everybody wants to sit with their back against the wall.
There's so many habits you have to challenge yourself on, right? Like even for me, like I left with 14 years and I still to this day, like I have to literally walk out the door and go, okay, what things do I need to actively do today to try and do it differently so I can teach myself that I can trust someone right out of the gate. I don't have to think that they're going to murder me, right? But those are skills you learn in Depot that keep you alive.
Yeah. And actually it's very interesting. It's one of the things that I started to do in order to start taking a bit more control, but in a healthy way to my day-to-day life. When I decided I was going to start countering this, I was, going to start doing the work. And it began by changing how I approached my entry to the building at work. So I was feeling a lot of shame and a lot of frustration and anger and overwhelm at just having to come into the building every day and dread. I don't know if you know that feeling of dread of just having to walk into the building. And I said, oh, I have to change it. And so that was my first thing. I said, I have to change that. And so I just began by making eye contact and saying hello to everybody I ran into. And interestingly, it made my day better because people started to look forward to it. And then I started to know people's names and a little bit about them. And the ripple of that was that people would actually actively come and seek me out because they also were feeling those things. And so just having a real, conversation rather than just oh, how are you doing? I'm busy, which is our standard response, to change that just a little bit. And I just one little thing at a time, one person at a time, just trying to change the repetition of how I had been behaving. And so I shifted it entirely.
That's a very advanced thought. Very advanced thought.
But it was like, I was taking yoga teacher training at the time. So in my defense, I was trying to do everything upside down.
That makes sense. Hey, but that's literally like PTSD can flip your world completely upside down. And now all of a sudden you're having to do these life just so differently in order to bring something back up to the surface, something that's familiar, right? One of the things that you also talked about earlier was how you, maybe when you're triggered or you're facing something that you're not trying to control, but you're feeling like you maybe are not in control, is keeping busy.
Yes. Yeah, I really wanted to touch on this because while a lot of the things are similar, we all respond in different ways. And for me, on a day-to-day basis, I actually make light of it. I'm like, this is what walking wounded looks like, because a lot of people that I know think that I'm a high achiever. I work very, very hard. I hold myself to a very high standard. But this is a trauma response for me, and I have to be very, very mindful of it. I have to set myself up with people around me to call me on it, because I will say yes to everything. I will burn myself out in order to avoid having to deal with the things that I don't really want to face myself. So my trauma response is actually doing more. And so I have to be really aware of that, because the potential for burnout for me is very, very high. But I know I work with a psychologist weekly right now because of the type of content that my work is currently. And I have a bunch of people. I have plants, like my immediate team that I work with, who is amazing. But then I also have colleagues that I trust, that know me and know me well, who I have specifically spoken to and said, hey, I need you to check in on me too, because you don't see me every day, and I need you to come and make sure that my baseline's good, and call me on my bullshit. Sorry for the language, but
I've had much worse.
Okay. Wasn't sure if we were PG or not.
I leave it open to the person. You steer the ship. So for you, like, how do you, or have you recognized kind of what the theme is where you might get pulled into this coping mechanism of trying to stay busy to avoid?
Right.
And again, we don't have to get super personal about it either, right? But just, have you kind of developed what that theme is? Is it something that may cause anxiety, or, when is it that all of a sudden you flip into, okay, I'm going to stay busy now and I'm going to focus on something else in order to avoid this, which causes me X, Y, or Z?
Yeah. I think it's often maybe when things at home are feeling a little unstable, or there's just a lot going on at work, and I don't want to sort of deal with it, for lack of trying to. I work on being super self-aware, so I'm just trying to think of how I would say it to somebody who maybe wouldn't recognize it in themselves. But it's just that, an example, somebody was talking to me recently because they wanted to do a social media presentation, and they're like, oh, we heard that you might know something about social media. And I was like, yeah, no, I administrate in my spare time 4 Facebook pages with thousands of people in them. I volunteer on the NPF's Equity, Inclusion, and Diversity Committee, but I didn't volunteer. I'm one of the 12 people that initiated that platform, and now a year later we're still trying to move that forward. These are just things I do outside of my regular but these are all avoidance things that I do in order to it looks really good, it feels really good, but I'm not actually dealing with the thing that I should be dealing with, which is maybe working on my marriage, or doing a little self-reflection, or practicing my own self-care. holding
Yeah,
space for other people as a diversion.
I think a lot of times too, even for myself, as I reflect on this, a lot of times when I knew I needed to do something, which maybe was going to challenge the post-traumatic stress, I would do something else and I would get busy with that in order to not have to go back and deal with the pain of, whatever it was that was going on.
Exactly. There's a recent example. My daughter started going to see a counselor, and I'm really happy about that. And the counselor asked me to go in and sit and just have a conversation about how things were going, and maybe give me some guidance as a parent to support her. And it's all super positive. And I came out and I started a new Facebook page and practicing on TikTok because I thought it's something totally different. Rather than actually like dealing with the fact that my parenting skills might be being critiqued.
And that's an avoidant behavior we learn, right? Instead of having to deal with the pain of recognizing that, okay, I'm maybe not that good of parent that I thought I was, or there's some very real issues that I'm causing in the family. I'm going to go and do something different. It can be that simple. Sometimes it's just avoiding the emotions. PTSD wants to keep you numb and detached.
Exactly. It's because your brain's trying to keep you safe, right? The lizard brain comes active, and it's like, hey, this is the most important thing, and also, certain things are soothing, right? And hearing from other people that you're awesome feels really good.
Totally.
So it really does require a lot of like awareness. That you're doing it. And as I say, my spouse and I have a really good communication around this, and we're both very comfortable with challenging each other on it in a way that's not, not critical. It's just like, hey, seems like maybe you're taking on more than you should again, or, for him, it might be something else, but.
I'm going to even reflect too, even on my own journey, which is probably quite similar to yours. So before you even acknowledge that you had PTSD, like for me as a young police officer, I went 110 miles everywhere in life.
Yep.
Right. And it was almost like this twisted coping mechanism that I had summoned up for myself to, despite knowing very early on that I was starting to go through some very serious changes, I just stayed busy and hoped that I was okay.
Right.
And it was such an unhealthy approach. Now, something I also learned about too, which might help you kind of think back to kind of what this might looked like, was survivor's guilt. This was a term that I never really had heard until much later on in my career. But survivor's guilt is another thing that kind of leads us down a path of pulling in this idea that we need to stay constantly busy in order to avoid any painful emotions that may have come from watching someone die in front of us or watching death at whatever stage, that it happens. So survivor's guilt too can be this layer of wanting to stay busy constantly. Like I noticed too, even when I go for a walk, this is where survivor's guilt gets me. When I go for a walk, my pace is always through the roof. It's always fast. And then I'm always like, okay, I got to slow down. And then when I slow down, I invite the body to slow down and the mind to slow down. And now all of a sudden I'm able to ground and recover and, promote a safer space for the body to feel better.
Yeah. Exactly.
This is such an interesting topic.
It's so interesting. It just led me to think of it. Sorry to interrupt, but so I practice yoga. I have for a number of years. I lead yoga practices, and after Heidi Stevens, the Nova Scotia incident, I was kind of the person in our work. There weren't many people going into the office, but there were a number of, in excess of 50 people that I spoke to that day. And I stopped practicing yoga after that for a number of months because I couldn't be that vulnerable with myself. I couldn't practice on my own or with other people. I really had to find my way back to it with other fitness other fitness activities, because being in that space with myself was just way too raw and vulnerable. So I laugh.
Wow, that's
because
powerful.
What else do you do? Yeah, no, very interesting.
Are you okay to explore that real quick?
Sure, yeah.
What was it about that event for you that caused that?
It wasn't the event itself. What I think we're all impacted when we hear of other police officers that are in these kinds of incidences. And I think that maybe I related to Heidi because she was a mother as well. But it wasn't that. What it was that my job, which is still my job, although we have learned a lot from that incident, and how I do my job is very different than it was at that time. But at that time, a big part of what we were doing was these in-person wellness walks, which in COVID was really hard to do. But I was still doing it, and I was also reaching out in other ways to connect with people individually within federal policing, which is my kind of umbrella. And the week prior to that, I had already received, I keep statistics just for my own purposes, just to sort of see how we're doing and whether we're reaching people. And I had 173 individual requests for support, which were, some of them were, simple as I just need to access my benefits, but a lot of them were my spouse has left me, I'm suicidal, my child is struggling, I'm struggling, and they were really personal. So it was just a lot already. And then with that incident, I did what we had done in the past, which was to go and make my presence known to the people who were in the building, and people were in pain already and struggling with COVID, and then this was just too much. And so people saw me, and we had established quite a bit of trust by that time because I'd been there for a year, that everybody was really comfortable to tell me their story. And so I got home and I broke down. I cried for half an hour. I just couldn't stop. I cried for half an hour. My husband was like, "What happened?" And I couldn't even tell him, because there's just no words. There still isn't words for holding that kind of space. And so, yeah, I had to put the cap on it because I couldn't just keep going like that. So like I said, from there, we made some changes at work, but as I say, I stopped practicing yoga. I had to really rein myself in a whole bunch of places because I did that. The combination of those things was, yeah, very, very, very harmful to me personally, and wasn't a healthy space at all. So
when we lose a brother or a sister, we may not know them, but when we lose them, we feel that.
Yeah. And you have to know too, like I have, my own close, like my partner, I mentioned my partner at work, had a officer involved shooting. My spouse had been in an officer involved shooting. My best friend was shot at work. She survived and she's doing really well. But I had all of those other experiences, my own personal responses to the situation, but then holding space for other people, which is really important to me. Yeah, and I just didn't. I don't think anybody has the capacity for what that was at that time. If they do, I'd like to meet them and know what their tricks are.
Well, and that's kind of the interesting side of the coin, right? As you and I sit here and we feel the pain that comes from the loss of Heidi, mm-hmm. and the tragedy behind that, and then the tragedy behind every other single Mountie that has been killed in the line of duty tragically. I love the fact that I can feel that pain now, but there was a point in my career when I had lost a brother or a sister and I felt nothing.
Yeah.
And that was scary.
Exactly.
That place is scarier than this right now.
Yeah.
Because that place is very different.
Exactly.
So as much as someone listening on the other end of this may say, wow, these two are just sitting here crying, like what's going on here? No, we're happy to be feeling. To feel is a human thing. And to be a police officer and go through these very significant events, there is no shame in having to feel this kind of stuff. We're human. Doing an incredibly difficult role of policing.
Yeah. And we're proud of it. And that's the thing. Like, I'm proud of the work that we do. And I don't know. I just feel like, yeah, it's a shame when we don't feel it. And it scared me when I wasn't able to feel it anymore. that's a really great way of describing it. So thank you, Nate.
Well, yeah, I learned a lot, luckily enough for me. But yeah, I mean, and to go back to that, when you don't feel that kind of stuff, I mean, that's usually a very strong indicator that there's something very serious going on. And that deserves some exploration for sure. You talked a little bit too about some of the addictive things that can happen when we're suffering from PTSD and overexposure to trauma. You talked about it in the sense of, something that's very socially accepted, which is coffee culture, wine culture. I mean, I even at times too, even on the podcast, talk about different layers of addiction that go into, whether it's pornography or cell phone usage or anything that is kind of causing you to escape the present moment of reality, your emotions, whatever the case is, and get into a different headspace, right? And to try and control the mood and all that kind of stuff. You talked a little bit about it. I know that you're not in active addiction, right? You're still a very healthy human being. You enjoy a drink from time to time. There's no shame in that. You enjoy a coffee from time to time. There's no shame in that. But where we have to be careful of, and you nailed this earlier, was that you're very aware too of your consumption of these, more so the timing of it. How did you get to that point where you were so critical of yourself, and when you were, say, maybe having a glass of wine or having a coffee, and like what for you kind of really tied this together of, okay, I need to pay a little bit more attention here?
I started to feel like I was not, like I needed both. I couldn't not have the wine and I couldn't not have the coffee. But I could, because the wine helped me wind down, and it was fun, and it brought out my personality, all the silly things that you tell yourself that aren't actually true. And then I would need the coffee in the morning in order to get through the day or whatever. And it would start earlier in the day, especially when we started working from home for a little bit of time. So then that work day would end and I wouldn't have that buffer of like driving home and having to prepare dinner. So it would be like, oh, work day's over. Let's have a glass of wine. It just started to creep to a place where I didn't feel really good about it. And so I now I'm a one coffee a day. And then I just push the wine as late in the day as I can. It's a work in progress. So
Hey, I have nothing but respect for the person that has awareness into everything that goes into the body in this journey of PTSD. That's all we can ask for, right? I'm not saying that everybody has to stop doing things in their life, but at least if you have awareness into why you're doing it, you're going to be okay. Right. You're going to be one step ahead of the game. So that, I think it's actually fundamental too for a lot of people, especially with cop culture. Like you said, after a shift or after something significant that happens, and I saw this, I don't know how many times, we would go through a traumatic event and then everybody would be like, hey, let's go for a drink. And then you go for a drink and you'd laugh about it and instead of cry about it.
Exactly.
Or talk about
and
the
you know
fear.
What the funny thing is, it makes people more comfortable. It makes so that's why we do it. It makes other people comfortable to like have a glass of wine or a beer or whatever after work and laugh it off. It makes people really uncomfortable when I cry in front of them, but I don't cry all the time. Although I sometimes feel it's more than I should, but it makes people uncomfortable, but they know it's real, right? I laugh and I cry and I feel, and I think it's important. And I try to do that for other people, in space with other people, and just try to be really honest about all of it because, but I do make a lot of jokes about coffee. I will say that. But I only have one a day.
Only one will never get you to rehab. The interesting thing, and you talk about this, is being emotionally vulnerable at work. I don't think I saw a man be emotionally vulnerable at work over the course of my career.
No.
And I know for a fact. I see it a
lot now.
And I know, well, I thank God, right?
Yeah.
People that get uncomfortable with emotion at work, like say police officers, it's always the ones that suffer the most that are the most uncomfortable by the emotion.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a big kind of yellow flag for me to maybe make a little bit of extra space for somebody who is responding in that way, because often it's just that they haven't really had a time to do any self-reflection, and maybe they might be struggling too. So yeah, I try to have a lot of compassion for people who are really angry or really
Disconnected.
yeah, or you know making poor decisions. As I often feel there's probably something more going on.
The
But,
story I gave
not
about
that it's my job, but just to connect them
no,
with people who might be able to help them.
for
Sorry,
sure.
go ahead.
And I mean, these are the very small, subtle things that happen to us in the beginning stages of our PTSD, where we maybe don't see the change happening, but it's definitely happening. Like when I was talking about my daughter coming to me and expressing, empathy and seeing me cry, like she came over and put her hand on my back and was genuinely like interested in me.
Yeah.
If a police officer can't do that for their fellow person, what does that mean for that police officer that can't hold space, compassion, empathy, sympathy for that other person that's going through a painful moment, right? There's a slight disconnect there that I would argue naturally has to have had happen in that moment. They may be suffering, they may have PTSD. The more normal thing for that situation is for people to actually come over and be like, "Hey, Jess, are you okay?"
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that also doesn't tend to happen in policing culture either, right? In the workplace, people just kind of go, "Oh, Jess is having a bad moment. I'm out of here."
Yeah. And then the problem that you and I have, Nate, is that we could go for days, because what you've taken my squirrel brain to is also how we isolate ourselves from the rest of the general public. We tend to, I'm a self-fulfilling prophecy. My husband's a police officer, my friends are police officers, but that's what we tend to do, is to surround ourselves with other police officers who kind of doesn't make us very good police officers when we don't talk to our neighbors, and doesn't do us any favors either to not engage with other parts of society, and hear other people's stories, like you said, stories, hearing people's stories and being in space with them and being their coaches and being the leaders that we are in community. When we surround ourselves with like-minded people, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that we end up injured.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And care and compassion is one of the first things that goes out the window when you start to go down that road. You've talked a little bit about the perfectionism too in life, and that unsustainable high achieving standard that you set for yourself. Why is that?
I think that's the control piece of PTSD. A big part of PTSD is the need to be in control. And then the other side of that coin, which I don't know if a lot of people talk about, I don't know if you've touched on it, is the memory lapsing. Like, one of the things this is a cognitive injury to your brain. And so your ability to remember things has a lot of potential to be impacted. And so we've already talked about the fact that, like, from as early as Depo, we're taught that we need to be in control. Things need to be neat and tidy and organized. We must stay on top of our diary dates, all of those messages. And then when our injury is active, or we're right in depression, or right in a cognitive reaction, something has to give. So often it's memory. So that's, that high level of standard that I need to have. And now I've built a whole bunch of things in my life in order to manage the fact that my memory is going. So that I can put it down at the end of the day and sleep, which is foundational in our home, we've talked about before. But to be able to set it down and not worry that I've forgotten something that's critical or feels critical to me.
So going back to perfectionism, like for me, when I walked into depot and I was taught, how to make sure that everything was done perfectly, right? The polishing of the boots, the cleaning of the gun. And I mean, when we're talking about like perfectionism, that when you were there, sometimes your gun was taken away from you and your instructor pulled it apart and somehow they would find like a tiny little piece of dust somewhere in that firearm and it wasn't good enough.
Yeah. Oh
You
my
failed.
gosh, yes. Yeah.
And you now start using that same methodology to every single degree of your training, the writing of your Crown reports, the way you collect the evidence, the way you do your job. You approach it with this perfectionism where you cannot make a mistake. And while, yes, that's a certain aspect of policing, but that is not how healthy human beings approach life. Mistakes are allowed. Failures are allowed. They're celebrated. That's how we grow. That's how we learn. But the unfortunate part in policing is it's really something where the RCMP takes it to a different degree and they say we cannot allow failure. There's too much risk behind it. And
they're not wrong. Like that's the
they're
thing
not.
Is that there is a certain amount. You do need to be prepared. You do need to be prepared to do the job. You need to be fit and healthy in all parts of your body and your mind. You have to. But the reality is that when you take the uniform off at the end of the day, you need to be able to put that down and function in the rest of your life, right? Like you don't have to be that ready all the time.
And it's very hard to do that too, right? To take the uniform off to now embrace maybe a more normal way of living where you're not chasing perfectionism. And sometimes for us, I think those lines can definitely get blurred. And again, I don't come out here to blame the RCMP for this way. A lot of these things that are put in place are designed to keep us healthy and to keep us alive on the job. They have to happen, but they change us.
Exactly.
Right? We just have to be aware as to, how deep this can go. So that's awesome that you brought this up to, as well, because I know a lot of us suffer from perfectionism as well. And it can cause a whole bunch of
and so I always
different
wonder,
issues.
is it the perfectionism of the training or is it a coping mechanism? And those are self-inquiries, right?
The other aspect, obviously, to this, like you and I were just talking about, was the memory. And it's not something that I fully understand, but I think, too, when we experience enough traumatic events, the brain's ability to store memories also gets impacted. So now, even as a younger male or a younger female, we're now noticing that our memories are definitely impacted, probably negatively because of our experiences, right? The mind just doesn't really want to store the memories as well anymore. It could be argued that we're getting older, yes, but I also think too, there's a lot of times too where I just forget things that I shouldn't be forgetting. So that is very much an issue for me, is an issue for you, and it can be frustrating.
Absolutely. And I've done a bit of work because with my yoga teacher training, and I did a trauma-informed extension of my training, and then also doing courses like mental health first aid and a few other courses around mental health and PTSD and trauma. And there is science behind it that it does impact, the brain is impacted cognitively. So there's science there as well. And then also if you add in sleep deprivation from working shift work, those sorts of things, then it's just amplified. So
yeah, all the nutritional issues that come from it. Something that was actually interesting, we were talking about that just before we launched this episode, was too, for females. A lot of times females will not hydrate during shift because you have to take off the belt and you've got to find a bathroom. And if you're on the road for 12 hours, it can become an issue. So sometimes we just learn we don't hydrate.
Yeah, there's actually a book of stories that were put together, and that's actually one of the stories in the book is that a female member telling the story of just having to like push through an entire like almost an 18-hour shift and not using the bathroom once because they were just sitting on a scene and they couldn't leave. So it was like either hold it or wet themselves. So you just get to a point where you're just like, I won't have anything to drink. I was saying, no, I just bought myself a belt that made it easy to get off. So I didn't want to be that girl.
Let's keep it PG. Let's keep it PG. Now, your PTSD, you've done a really good job of kind of painting a picture of what your PTSD looks like through your journey of your service. And now you're in a federal position as a wellness coordinator. And something that I absolutely, and I talked about this at the very onset of this, was the compassion that you can now bring to the table in your position, and you can champion for people. And no doubt people feel safe coming forward to you and telling them, I'm broken, or I'm confused, I'm in the fog, I don't understand PTSD, what am I going through? People have these conversations with you. Now, are you able to I know we're not going to talk directly about the stats, the internal stats of how many people in the RCMP have PTSD. I know it's very substantial. There have been external studies that have touched on this. Can we talk about that?
Yeah, so I took a training. It was actually hosted by the Abbotsford PD, and I think it was called Trauma-Informed Leadership. It was during Mental Health Week about 3 years ago, and I think it was Bob Rich was the OIC of Abbotsford at the time, and so they brought in a team of psychologists, and they taught a 2-day session on trauma in the workplace and a trauma-informed approach to leadership. And there was a study done, and I was actually intending to bring it, but I couldn't find it today. But it was done out of Alberta, I believe, but it was done across Canada. And of course, the stats were voluntary, and they were anonymous, and they were through all first responders that responded across the country. And the numbers for people in active mental illness, so PTSD, anxiety, depression, those kinds of things. And a lot of us are familiar with the color scale, green to red. So that would put them in the orange and red area, just for reference. And so first responders as a whole are anywhere between about 21 to 25% of first responders kind of across the country are in that space. The RCMP scored a little higher. We're high achievers, and that we were closer to 50%. And then, just my experience in managing pages across the country, like Facebook pages across the country, the number of people, colleagues, and people I don't know who reach out to me, I would wager to say that there's a lot that are undiagnosed, and that the numbers may be even higher than that. And I think a part of that is that we're removed from our supports as part of being part of the RCMP. Part of our programming is to be removed from our supports. And so I think that maybe some of the reason that our numbers may be higher is partially that, where we're removed from the people who might be able to say, hey, wait a minute, things don't seem right. So we might not get the help earlier. That's me speculating.
One of the things I learned quite a while ago, actually, when I first started podcasting, was I had two gentlemen reach out from the States, and they were part of California Highway Patrol. And they said, Nate, you got to come down. You got to be on our podcast. We love listening to you talk. So I joined them, and we actually had a conversation around this very point, how a lot of Mounties leave their support systems in order to go off in police. And the Mounties is big on that, right? You sign on the dotted line, we're going to send you anywhere we want to. Now, when I started to talk about it that way, because that was my perspective too, both of them said, hey, you know what, we actually think you're wrong on this, because we actually went back to our hometowns with family, and we ended up with PTSD too. So I think PTSD actually might just become part of our world regardless of where you are. But you are right. And I think in the sense, Jess, that if we do not and are not going back to our support system, there's a high likelihood that our PTSD could come into the picture much earlier, because that support system isn't there, right? We're already socially disengaged with.
Yeah, no, I could definitely see that. And I just wondered if it was because our numbers were from this one study were so significantly higher that maybe that might be a piece of because it was almost double. When I heard the stat, I was shocked, knowing, I mean, mind you, at that time, my husband and I were very actively working through our PTSD, and I had a really clear picture of what the really, really dark places that can be are. And when they're talking about people being truly in the red, that's terrifying to me.
Absolutely. The plus 50% of people, first responders out there diagnosed with PTSD. I mean, that is a very alarming stat. But like you were saying, the other 50% that aren't diagnosed could easily fall into that. You know, the members who are 1 to 3 years, who are just starting to go through some of the trauma. They're not fully kind of aware yet as to what their PTSD might look like, or the fact that it's onsetting. And then also a large portion of people that no doubt suffer from this but refuse to acknowledge it. I was always of the opinion, especially after I had left, that 100% of us will go through PTSD. How far do we go down that rabbit hole of PTSD? I mean, that really depends on the person and their overall health strategy. So I try to say it that way because when you remove this thought of, I'm going to be okay, I'm never going to get it, that's when it's going to hit you the hardest. That's something that I approach that way. I'm not saying everybody has to, but for me, I think a lot of us go through this.
I think a lot of us do. And I'm much like you, I can hear the sort of like the struggle of it in how you're explaining it, because it's like the likelihood of you experiencing a brain injury, let's call it what it is, in your career are very, very high. But I'm also probably like, because I saw you kind of heard in your voice, you're like, I don't want to undervalue the experience of somebody who is living with that really intensive injury. And maybe there's somebody who really, they may have been experienced to a lot of traumatic things, but for whatever reason, it didn't cause the same sort of injury for whatever reason. And an example, you told your story of the horse, that and how deeply that impacted you. And maybe for somebody else, it would have not been that, right? But for you, that the totality of those circumstances was a huge impact for you, whereas somebody else maybe wouldn't have had that, and they wouldn't have considered that a trauma. I'm not saying that it wasn't a trauma, but I'm just, as an example, maybe going and seeing, an elderly person has passed away for the first time wouldn't be traumatic for somebody. My first time, it was traumatic. I wasn't expecting it. It wasn't what I was expecting to walk into, and it was traumatic for me. And there were other files that I went to that were way more gruesome, but that one stood with me, so like that one was traumatic.
And that's how PTSD happens. It's really our journey. It's the lens of life that we use to I guess, have or hold a perspective on life. And when we go through certain traumatic things, how we perceive that trauma and how we internalize it, that's where some of the issues can come from. Like you said, my trauma is so different than someone else's trauma.
Yeah.
It's not the same.
Compare. Like we can't compare them. Wise, he's a sergeant now that I worked with, said we were in a training session, and he said, well, he's like, everybody's trauma is their worst trauma. Like,
absolutely,
it doesn't matter whether it's that they stubbed their toe or or they went to a traumatic car accident. Like, it really doesn't matter. If it's traumatic for them, that's their truth. And it's their worst day.
Because we're talking about this, and we didn't really talk about this earlier, something that I'm kind of just thinking of in this moment is when I went away to rehab and I learned about, my policing trauma, and I was there to heal from my trauma. And then all of a sudden they were like, hey, that's great, we're going to do that. But the real issues exist with your childhood trauma.
Mm.
Have you started to explore childhood trauma at all?
Yeah. For me, I have a few things. So that's actually I had done that work. Thank God I had already done that work, a lot of that work before. I mean, it's still, as I say, we're in a marathon, not sprint, but those were underlying things that probably are what drew me to policing, if I'm honest. So, you know, let's be,
Oh,
there's things
totally.
that draw us to this work.
Totally. It's a unique profession. And I mean, even though my heart was in the right place and I wanted to be a police officer for the right reason, I cared for people. I can definitely look back now that I've finally accepted that there is childhood trauma in my past and I understand this whole concept and I'm not running away from it anymore saying, no, this didn't happen to me. Because when I first walked into rehab, I had this conversation with the therapist. They're like, Nate, you have childhood trauma. And I'm like, no, I don't. My childhood was normal. And then they're like, well, tell me about it. And I'm like, well, what do you want to know? Right. And you could tell like I was already feeling like put up the wall. And it was when my therapist finally asked me the perfect question where I just broke down in the chair and I was like, okay, yeah, there's something there for sure. We need to talk about it, right? And then as you start to talk about it and you start to see what your childhood trauma is and how it impacts you and then how it's later tied to the trauma that you go through as a police officer, you really start to understand your trauma so much better. And now that, you know, that piece of yarn that's all knotted and torn and, you know, just mangled and it's long and it covers your entire life, you can start to unwind it.
Exactly.
And put it back into shape.
Exactly.
And
I'm very lucky that I had a mother who did a lot of her own work and encouraged me to do a lot of my work because we had a shared trauma when I was very young. So yeah, luckily I did a lot of work throughout the years because I had a mother who was self-aware enough to kind of encourage me in that direction.
And that's one of
But
the
yeah,
things
no,
like
I agree. Yeah.
I always try to be careful with childhood trauma because there are still people that are going to come out and say, no, you're absolutely wrong. I don't have it. That's okay. That's your story. If that's what you want to believe for right now, I totally support it. But for me, yeah, once I finally acknowledged my childhood trauma and I was able to see it and deal with it and talk about it and deal with some of those emotions that had been processed in years, I finally found that I was starting to heal and create a new foundation to heal from. And that's where, for some of us, our healing needs to start.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I guess I think for what happened with me is it's what ended up leading me to teaching yoga, that kind of thing, is because I needed the next level, right? I had done a little bit of that. I mean, it's ongoing and it's a work in progress. And I have, you know, other things. Divorce is not easy, and, you know, shared parenting with somebody that you're no longer married to, those are not easy things. So I have new traumas, but, you know, so it's a marathon. And it's like, marathons are great.
You're naturally a very optimistic person. They are great because they can give you an opportunity to run them. You sound, to be honest with you, Jess, you sound to be like you're flourishing where you're at right now in life. And that is the most important thing for me when I connect with people that have PTSD, is they've gone through all of the hard stuff. They recognize, you know, what it looks like for them, whether it's the depression, the anxiety. Do they go through addiction issues? Have they touched on suicide or suicidal ideation? How deep does the pain go? But eventually, once you get to a place where things aren't good, you have to realize, okay, you are more important than this job, this career, your pain. You deserve to actually enjoy your life. So you at 19 years, and we've talked, Lucy, about this, you are not at the tail end of your career, right? I mean, you can still go for many, many years, but you've put so many amazing things together for yourself, the yoga, and you're looking at the future as well. You're still young, so you can go on to do many different things with your life. And that's the promising thing with this, is post-traumatic stress doesn't have to be post-traumatic stress disorder. It can be post-traumatic growth.
Exactly.
So where are you going?
Oh, well, it depends on the week. My husband and I have many, many conversations. I don't want to, you know, show my cards too soon, but, you know, there is talk of what it would look like to maybe move on to something else. We both really love our careers though, and we feel connected to it. Right now, I'm just really excited about the things that we're building in the workplace. So I don't know if it's a good opportunity to sort of talk about that. So I've been in this unit, which is such a privilege. Like, what a gift. I hear frequently, and yes, it's gonna, after all we've just said, is gonna sound like, oh, it's like trauma response. But I do hear frequently from people that I'm in the right time and the right place to be in this role. And I do believe that that is true. And I also believe it can be taught. So I came in, I had the privilege of being in the workplace while I was supporting my spouse, working through being off for an extended period of time and seeking treatment, various different types of treatment. And then my own personal experiences of just, having to take mat leave and pat leave, getting to take mat leave and pat leave, having to access my benefits for my injured back, my concussion. I had to have some surgeries over the years. So I've had the opportunity to really make use of all of the things that are available to us, and I'm really quite fluent in what our benefits are and how to access them. And I also have this compassion piece of knowing that a lot of us have experienced traumatic events, and that often by the time that we've sought help, things are often quite bad by the time we put our hand up to ask for help. And when somebody has decided that they need to take some time off work, things are frequently really, really, really bad. I often use the example when I'm doing presentations about what we do. When we were on GD, working 4 on 4 off and call to call or whatever our shifts were, I know many of us would, come in very, very ill, or, even throwing up, and then you throw up and then you go and run to a call, and then, I'm good, I'll stick it out because you didn't want to leave anybody short. So that mindset is with many of us. And so when somebody gets to the point where they're like, I need to take a month off, things have gotten pretty, because they don't want to let their team down, right? So the position posted for this wellness coordinator position, which in 2018 sound right? It's been there for 3 years. My math is terrible. Anyway, and what they were doing was that it was taking care of people who were off sick, was basically what the job was supposed to be. And so the job posted, and I had a bunch of phone calls from people just saying, Jess, are you going to apply for the job? And I was I was working files, and I had just promoted to corporal in the unit that I was in, and organized crime and drug trafficking, and it's super exciting. And I was file coordinating, which I like, which I know nobody else does, but I really like it. And I really wasn't interested in taking that kind of turn in my career to go administratively. So I went and I met with them about the job, and I said, I saw this posting and I'm considering putting in for it because a lot of people called, but I'm only interested in if you're willing to completely change how it's done, because I don't think that I don't think that the way it's being done is going to work. And I have a lot of good ideas. And they were like, that's exactly what we want. You have the blueprint, come. So I was like, okay. And I was also very lucky to work with, there was a public servant who was new to the RCMP. He hadn't worked with the organization before. Which is a blessing, and is part of the way that we have set ourselves up, because they bring in new, fresh ideas. They're from outside, which Nate, you and I have talked about the importance of having people from outside of the organization that have experience and training and skills in things that we aren't skilled at, so that we can be really good at what we are good at. And so I told him what I wanted to do, and he was like, yeah, I'm in. So it's taken a bit of time, and we have a lot more work to do, obviously, but we've shifted the entire focus. So if somebody takes time off, we assume that it's because they need to, and that they want to get healthy and well and be back at work. So everything that we do is based on that assumption. We make sure that they're connected with the people in health services, which if anybody's listening to this, health services is like our work safe. And we really have to get out of the mindset that the health services is supposed to take care of us. They are a resource that's available to us, but they're not like your regular family doctor or your regular family psychologist or a nurse at the hospital. They work for the employer, and they are interested in helping us to get to our well-being with the resources they have available to us. But it's not their job day to day to hold our hand through the process of getting healthy. And so we just really define the roles. So their job is to know that you're not feeling well and what you need. That's what their job is. And you can get them that information in a way that feels safe to you, right? Like that feels safe, because obviously we're talking about medical information. They are very protective of it. And if you can get them what you need, the information about what you need, they are very eager to help you to get where you need to go. And I think that you said that was in the end your experience, Nate, was that health services did help you to get funding for the things that you needed. Yes, no?
Yeah, no, they were very much supportive. I think for myself, I viewed health services as kind of an adversarial unit for a long time, but I was also unwell. And then when I finally recognized that I needed to embrace vulnerability and reach out and ask for help, they actually showed up perfectly, and they were amazing with me, and they did exactly what I had asked for, and they gave me the support that I felt I needed. Yeah, so through and through, amazing people. They're definitely there to help you out. I don't know where, I mean, it's probably because of the PTSD, we begin to have trust issues, and we begin to look at health services as the demon. That's not accurate at all. Like they're good people. They're there.
Sometimes they're, for people who are working in a first responder role that are listening, they have an average of 125 diary dates at any given time. So, they got so they do a lot of cut and paste. And so it can feel really impersonal is the first thing that sometimes comes across. And when you're in crisis or you're in need for something to be fixed, the last thing you really want, you prefer it to be more compassionate delivery, for sure. So we talk about that with people a lot. We'll be like, okay, so sometimes the delivery, but it's not that they don't want to help you. It's just that they're super busy and they're trying to manage as well. So like, let's get past that. And then there's also just a lot of rumor. Oh, if I end up on a medical profile of certain profile or whatever, then I'm going to get fired, which is just not, it's just not based in fact. There is an accountability. There's a change in language, which it used to be that we had unlimited medical, but that's not true. It's not unlimited, but it is as needed. So as long as you are doing your part to seek treatment and try and get healthy and well, you're good for a fairly long amount of time. But you have to be doing your job. There's an obligation as an employee and an employer to try and get you back to work healthy. That's everybody's job. So anyway, we just try and really clarify the roles of health services or WorkSafe if it was a different organization, because we do deal with some of the public servant. This is what they do. This is how you get who you ask and how you ask to get to the yes. And then we spend a lot of time now, whereas I used to do it individually and I would reach out to the people that were off myself, recognized very early on that wasn't actually helpful. It just introduced another person to the already overwhelming pile of people. And so what we do now is we meet with the supervisor when they let us know that somebody's maybe taken some time off. We will, and they don't even have to tell us who it is. That's the beauty of this, is that we don't have to know anybody's specific information. If they choose to disclose it to us themselves, that's their own, but we don't have to know. A supervisor can just say, hey, somebody's off. What do I do? And then we help them to figure out who is somebody on their unit that the person already has a connection with. Let's have a conversation early about what that looks like and how we can keep them meaningfully connected to the workplace while we support them to do whatever it is. And then we do a lot of stigma busting. So if you see somebody out at the golf course and they're ODS, go and ask them if you can play with them next time, right? Do not rumor about somebody if you see them running a marathon. because they are running a marathon. They're off. If they're off and they're supported by health services, in federal policing at least, I can say 100%. If somebody works for federal policing and they are off on long-term ODS, they are supported because we've made sure that they're supported by health services, and they have to do what they have to do to get healthy. So we built the whole program based on that. And then now we don't have to spend a lot of time on that part of the process because the supervisors and their teams are creating space where hopefully they'll feel healthy and safe to come back when they're ready, right? Because they're welcome back because they're supported by their colleagues and their supervisor and health services and us if they want. And we spend a lot of time just focusing on how we make the workplace well. So fitness for duty, again, stigma busting. We do team buildings. We do a lot of supervisor support where we just help the supervisor to take a compassionate approach because they get so busy with their things that sometimes they forget. And then I teach yoga and meditation. And we've created some restorative resting spaces based on a bunch of science around sleep. And keeping people healthy at work. They do this in Japan a ton, but there's actually a study out of Calgary on RCMP members and shift workers on fatigue management. And part of it is having these restorative spaces where you can go and rest if you need to, or to rejuvenate, to safely get some rest before you drive a significant distance home. We have a lot of people who drive over an hour to get to and from work every day. So they need that rest in the middle of the day in order to safely get home. So we're just always trying to think of ideas that are more supportive front end rather than waiting until somebody is already injured. Encourage people to use their benefits, that sort of thing. Okay, that was a lot. So
That's a big role. That's perfect. No, and even from my own journey of just having had gone through what I had been through, I knew in moments when I wasn't receiving the support that I felt I deserved, my healing was not going to progress. When I was met with complete support and understanding, things for me just moved along so much more efficiently. It allowed me to heal. So I'm actually happy to hear that the RCMP now is taking this stance of, we support you, go off, take the time that you need to take the knee. We'll check in with you once in a while. We'll try to stay out of your face. We are here to support you because we still do need that. And you're absolutely right. We don't get to let people go off for prolonged periods of time and just run amok, right? That's not the way this works. The employer has a duty to you to make sure that you are doing the things you need to do while off to get better so that you can come back to work. They're paying you for that. It's no different than a contract being in place. That's your employer. You've signed a contract to work for them.
Yeah. And I think a lot of us have, it's the thing that they tell us, back to our earlier conversation about Depot, is that, the RCMP is your family, but they aren't really. They're your employer, and there are people that you'll meet throughout your career that will feel like family, for sure. But at the end of the day, health services isn't your family. They are people who are there to support you, to access your benefits. That's it. It's hard. Sometimes it's a hard pill to swallow to think of it that way, but when you sort of take that idea and put it into, the RCMP isn't my family is my family, and there are people in the workplace that I really like and respect, and I can work with those people. And that's the thing, it's a big organization, so there's always somebody that you can pick to be in contact with if although it shouldn't be your wife if she works in the workplace.
So for you, obviously you guys are at the cutting edge. You're trying to change the way things are being done in the RCMP, and I applaud you for that. Where is this going to go over the next 5-10 years? And what are some of the things that you think need to be done that might not be being talked about right now?
I think, okay, so there were two questions there. There is a big move. These wellness positions are popping up all over the country. I think there are about 12 of them in the Lower Mainland. We have an actual overarching unit. I'm not part of it, but there is a unit that's, they're building and trying to create things. So there is movement across the country to try and improve things, and it's so multifaceted that it's really, it's going to take a long time. There. So my response is, there are things happening, but really we still have to stay grassroots in that we have to continue to look after one another in meaningful ways. And so the things I'm seeing also, things like there's a member, I don't know if you want me to say his name or not, but that has started hosting weekend meetups for members who may have PTSD, who maybe have retired and want to stay connected or whatever. So they're gathering, which I think is really cool. Another colleague of his, I believe, is like running a running group. They just ran I think they just ran the Vancouver Marathon. They for sure did the Sun Run, and I think I saw some of them were doing the Vancouver Marathon. There are Facebook pages that are gathering people who have PTSD, so the messaging is getting out so that we're gathering in spaces in order to support one another in a positive way, and that's one of the ways that you and I connected. And then, there are other ideas. Things that we need to think about are how we help people as they move into retirement, which I think is something that, and also just this continued effort to, I like to say, instead of stigma busting, that like shine light into the dark places. We need to, there are lots of us, and lots of us are struggling and lots of us are thriving. And those of us who have made it through kind of some of the harder bits can, shine the light back and be like, hey, here's the path forward. Because as I say, it is complicated. I've spoken to people of all like very diverse backgrounds, people of color, our Black community, our cisgendered, cross-gendered, transgendered, people have really, really complex situations. And so there isn't a big, this is what we're going to do and we're going to fix this and we're going to make the workplace a safe and healthy place. No, it's going to be, a multifaceted approach. But where I think the more that we can just believe each other's and share stories like you are, I think that's how we're going to slowly make this better.
I 100% agree with you. I think that it takes a community to get behind this issue in order to properly address it. One of the things I'm talking about right now is suicide and how suicide loves to lurk in the corners of silence. And for many of us, our rates of suicide in the first responder world are quite high as well. A lot of times we hear those stories and then it's unfortunately it's too late. We never knew this person was suffering. They were never showing any signs of it. So the only way to get ahead of it, I believe, is to truly build this compassionate community behind post-traumatic stress where everyone's welcome to show up as they are.
Exactly. And we'll never have those statistics because it's a private issue, and it's, unfortunately we won't ever have the actual statistics, and but it is a real thing, and I also know that because I've seen it a number of times in the last 3 years where one person just picking up the phone has saved a colleague's life. So it's a powerful thing when those thoughts sneak in, and you talked about them on your recent podcast about the evasive thoughts, and like, I didn't know it was not normal to think, oh, they might be better off without me. I didn't know that until I went to a psychologist, and they were like, no, people don't actually think that, Jess. And I was like, oh, okay, that's good to know, right? Like, and hopefully that's not shocking, but I'm saying it out loud because you need to say
it's not.
it.
It's not shocking at all. No, it's not. It's something that I too had to learn that, because there was so many times people were like, well, are you suicidal? And I was like, no. And they're like, well, are you having suicidal ideation, thoughts of not wanting to be here? Yeah. Okay, well, that's a form of suicide. Oh, really? And then we need to educate people on this, right? Because I didn't recognize even in that moment that just the simple thought of not wanting to be here was a very clear picture of I wasn't well.
Yeah, exactly. And it sounded different in my head, but it was that it wasn't, there was no planning, there was no desire not to be here. It was more like they'd be better off if I wasn't. Life would be easier. And we know that's not true. I know that's not true. And I knew that wasn't true at the time. But it took my doctor to, I would be like, oh yeah, well, sometimes they say that. And she's like, Jess, people don't say that. Like, that's not a healthy thought. There's nothing healthy about that thought process. And if those are coming to you, you need to really, she's like, those are the days you need to call me. When I say call anytime, that's the anytime.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. And it's such a sensitive topic to talk about one's mental health. But again, you highlighted why we're doing this, and we're doing this to help others who are, the ones that are behind us, that are, still paving their way forward through the RCMP, who have the more junior service, who we can at least hold our hand back and show them that some of the stuff that you're going through, this is very normal to go through it. This is how you talk about it. This is how you educate yourself in order to be able to talk about this. And this is how you get the help around it. Most people are going to go through this stuff. And that you can be really, really, really healthy. You can be really healthy and really, really happy and live a very contented, full, meaningful life and have PTSD. I couldn't agree more. Jess, if there was one thing in closing that you could leave the listener with today about your story, whether it's a message of hope or positivity or where we're going with this, what would it be?
Oh, that's a tough question. I think just believe yourself, take care of yourself, do it early, do it often, and when you have the opportunity, share your story and hold your hand out for another person.
Beautiful. The gift of giving back. Jess MacLean, everyone, 19 years. You have done so much for the Mounties. We know you are going to continue to do more for the Mounties and nudge this topic forward. We thank you for being in your position. We thank you for healing. We thank you for being who you are. It was a complete honor to have you here today, Jess. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you for everything that you're doing, Nate.
Thank you for joining us on Season 2. If you are a first responder with an incredible story into post-traumatic stress, please reach out and connect with myself. Season 2 is based on your story. And if you want to step up to the plate and share your story with the world, I would be more than honored to help you do that. Thank you for your continued support with this project, and thank you for tuning in today.